Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel like a stranger to all of the people here because I am a venture capitalist in the healthcare, but life sciences divisions of healthcare, really focusing on the development of therapeutics and some diagnostics. However, I totally understand how AI is changing the way we do things, and more understanding the importance of embracing AI and understanding it so that we will have the opportunity to really sort of change how we're innovating, but also changing how we're going to deliver healthcare in the future. So our panel today is a very illustrious panel, and we're very happy to have everybody with us. I will say, prior to introducing everybody, one of our panelists was not able to join us, and that's Tala Fakari, who is the Associate Director for Data Science AI Policy at the FDA. But with some of the recent policy changes, Tala was not able to join us. And so that's very unfortunate, and we're hoping that everything works out in the best possible way for her group as well as for us in having a wonderful innovator who's present at the FDA in the future. So I'm going to introduce everybody just very quickly by name and then ask them to introduce each other. So Greisen, who's the president of BioMap. Sofia Guerra, who is the vice president at Bessemer Venture Partners. Subha, Madhavan, who is the vice president and head of AI and ML and Quantitative and Digital Sciences and Global Metrics and Data Management at Pfizer. And Sonya Makhni, who's the medical director of applied informatics at Mayo Clinic. And so we're very excited to have each person introduce themselves. And maybe when you introduce yourself, you could also answer a really good way of starting out, I think, our discussions today, which is if you could each give one example of how AI has impacted or changed an outcome when applied to real-time patient care or the discovery or development of novel therapeutics. So make your introduction and then give us, a quick sort of synopsis of how you think it's changed an outcome. So Per, we'll start with you.
All right. So thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thanks for all of you for showing up today. So my name is Per, and I'm at BioMap, which is a company where I probably will start my introduction in the interface between, biology and tech. So that's actually what we try to do, is how can we actually apply technology to solve complex problems in the disease space. My role there is, beside having a lot of fun, because I actually think times today are actually really, really good times, but there's a Dickens quote that says the good times and bad times. So we'll probably touch upon both of that today. But basically, we have a lot of fun there, but really trying to see what these algorithms can do and the difference they can make. Because I think, even though this is a bio-IT conference, at the end of the day, are actually patients in need of how we actually develop and utilize these tools. But coming back to what we try to do there is then to develop these tools to accelerate the design of especially biologics. My role there is to interrogate what the AI can do, come up with scientific hypotheses that we can then experimentally validate in order to show what the algorithms actually can provide. But I think one of the things that we also have in this is to figure out what the algorithms cannot do yet, or where they have a really hard time to do this. And I think that's quite important in the space that we're in right now, is to figure out what are the success cases, what they can do today, but also what are the limitations for that. So if one of the things, I can talk hours about that, but I'll just, summarize it very short. One of the things where I've seen it is actually a drug in my previous life where we could actually apply data-driven methods and then in a very, very short time actually come up with a drug that's actually clinically approved now and is about to be commercialized, where we showcase that by actually collecting data and making sure that algorithms could actually work on these data, we could actually accelerate the development of this biologic bispecific antibody. I think that for me was like a moment, a eureka moment, where I saw that with these tools utilized right, you can actually do a lot of things and they're very powerful. Having said that, it's not a solution for everything, and I think we'll come into that during this panel discussion. But thanks, and look very much forward to it.
Thanks, Per. Hi, everyone. I am Sofia. I'm a vice president at Bessemer Venture Partners. We're a venture capital firm, actually the oldest VC in the world, dating 100 years over 100 years, we've been investing in technology or in other entrepreneurs. And we've been investing in healthcare for a couple of decades now. We do a lot of therapeutics investments, not myself, unlike Abbie. But I spent all of my time in services and software and AI opportunities in the intersection of healthcare and life sciences. So think about, I spent all of my time looking at what's the value chain and all of the steps that take to develop a drug, and then what are all the points where you can leverage technology and AI or services to do that, and then which are the areas in which you can partner with a startup or a company to do that in partnership. On the side of investing, we also do a lot of research and thought partnership, and we've been working on a survey in partnership with AWS that looks at surveying or interviewing a bunch of executives. We interview over 408. We're actually going to publish the results soon. That looks at where in the journey are executives in adopting technology across use cases and thinking about how they're making their buy versus build decisions and where there's going to be big opportunity for startups versus for internal teams. And I'm very excited to discuss this in the panel and share some of the insights from that research that will be published in a few weeks as well.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Subha Madhavan. I'm the global head of AI, ML, Quantitative, and Digital Sciences within Pfizer R&D. Our team is responsible for 3 primary objectives, the first one being what we call as clinical AI, ML, and the role here is to take clinical trial data, real-world evidence, biomarker, and other multimodal data to really inform next generation of treatments. And the second primary objective for us is to tap into these disruptive technologies like generative AI and large language models and agentic AI to improve our processes, and how do we augment them using some of these technologies. For example, are there regulatory corpus that we can automate the first drafts of, et cetera. And then the third objective for us is to tap into a care anywhere model, so where we can actually bring clinical trials to patients where they live using wearables and other devices, using which we can collect data to really inform the efficacy and safety of these drugs. Prior to Pfizer, I was a professor at Georgetown University Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center in Washington, D.C., had the opportunity to work with large hospital network called MedStar Health System. So I kind of saw the drug development from the other side of the fence, which is being a site, and how can we enable bringing patients to clinical trials, primarily in the oncology space. And prior to that, I was a federal government employee where, as we mentioned, there are lots of policy changes and lots of changes that are going on. But I spent a few years at the National Cancer Institute, really when programs like the Cancer Genome Atlas were developing. And now I saw a banner outside this conference room that said AI-ready data sets. And I think these were some of the programs that generated the large amounts of data using which we're actually able to build AI models today. So really excited to bring all those perspectives to this panel, and looking forward to a great discussion. Over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for having me. My name is Sonya Makhni. I am a medical director at Mayo Clinic Platform. I'm also a practicing physician at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. My specialty in my background is in bioinformatics, and my clinical specialty is in clinical informatics. And then another hat, I am in the startup hustle as a co-founder. So my work at Mayo Clinic and Mayo Clinic Platform really is at the intersection of the clinical delivery of care at the clinician level and technology. And so a lot of my work kind of follows the AI development life cycle and seeing how we can develop and design AI tools better, more responsibly, more effectively, all the way through how do we validate those tools, how do we deploy them into workflows, and how do we monitor for outcomes and this cycle as it repeats. So I kind of get to follow on the clinician side as well as the product and the engineering pieces. So I'm excited to be here today. And, I think to your question, how are we seeing AI actually benefit people today? And I think there's lots of examples. I think we'll talk about some of the risks and how maybe AI can potentially not benefit people. But through our platform, we've actually enabled partners to, in our de-identified data set, enable partners to develop solutions off of, millions of patient records, hundreds of millions of patient notes in weeks rather than months, and have them actually deploy those solutions into clinical workflows so that they can monitor them, test them, et cetera. And some of the partners that we've teamed up with and enabled, they've seen amazing outcomes in radiology, reducing the time to diagnosis from anywhere from 25% to 35% of certain conditions. And I think it's really exciting to talk about the wins as much as it is to talk about what we're worried about. And so, I think there's optimism, a lot of optimism that we can kind of share here.
If you hear expert commentary, and when they're asked what industries do we think that AI is going to disrupt the most, healthcare comes out over and over again from a lot of different surveys, a lot of different, sort of queries of people. And, the innovation that exists in healthcare today, you almost can't think of any aspect of healthcare or life sciences where AI isn't already impacting it, and it's been being used for quite a long time, but yet people suddenly feel we're in like a revolutionary moment and that everything is going to change because of AI. And there's some risks to that, which is, public perception, but there's also, other risks to sort of maybe using something too soon or trying to force the fit of a certain technology. If you could each, maybe Sonya, start with you and we'll go the other way. What do you see the biggest risks right now to the current attention being paid to AI in general?
Yeah, and like we said, there's pros and cons. I think what we saw in the last couple years is sort of a democratization of some of the tools. So in the clinician world, all of a sudden these large language models are now part of our everyday vernacular because they're more accessible. That doesn't imply reliable, et cetera. And with COVID, there's been a large shift in, wanting to open ourselves up to technology, which is a great thing. But I think that our ability to keep pace with the advancements with kind of complementary tools to monitor, assess outcomes, collect data on performance and outcomes and real, not just algorithmic performance, but clinical outcomes to demonstrate effectiveness and usefulness. I think our ability to monitor the safety and reliability of these tools has lagged behind a bit. So I think one of the bigger challenges and the risks that I battle with every day is kind of coming to terms that there's this really cool, awesome technology. Their marketing material really speaks a lot to all the possible benefits. But as a clinician, I don't know if I can trust this yet because I maybe don't fully understand it. Maybe it's not working in my workflows, and maybe it's just not fully proven to the point where I can, get behind it. And at the end of the day, my actions impact patients. So I think there's that, the complementary tooling to go with the advancements, I think, is what I see as the largest opportunity and risk as well.
Subha?
So I like to think of risk in sort of two categories. One is at the scientific level, and the other one is more at the technical level. So at the scientific level, for us, what's important is when you build these AI models, how is it impacting efficacy and safety of these drugs? And primarily safety, because you're putting these drugs into people. And so results of these AI models, to the extent that they're going to impact, how we assess safety, right? And I think this is where the human in the loop becomes extremely critical. And so most of the AI models that we build, we kind of classify them into high, medium risk categories. And then, the higher the risk, then there's more governance and more deployment of subject matter experts who can actually review this. NIST actually came out with a very good risk evaluation framework, which aligns with this high, medium, low. And then the lowest would be things that are more, colleague-facing, that are not external-facing. They're not facing patients or external stakeholders, but they're internal colleague-facing models. So you can be a little bit more, exploratory because there is going to be a team of experts that will review this. And then, the medium would be somewhere in between. And so, as we think about launching AI projects right at the start, thinking about how do you classify this risk, sort of helps us really operationalize that AI project. I think on the technical side, there's a lot of concern, and Kumar talked about explainability, which is a very important characteristic of any of these AI models. Is are there black box algorithms that people you can't really explain. And even with the explainability, what is the use case here? So if it is, let's say, a pathology slide, H&E slides that you're looking at, and you're deploying AI to delineate one cell margin from another, maybe you don't need to be extremely explainable, so long as the results can be verified and validated. But then if it is impacting patients, then obviously you want that model to be explainable. The challenge that we're having with large language models is it's gorging hundreds of terabytes of data, and it's this lumbering statistical device that's predicting the next conversational word. And so what exactly has gone into it, and extensive discussions and debates around hallucination and bias and factual accuracy, right? So those are some of the technical risks that have to be evaluated as we launch any of these AI projects.
Thanks. Sofia?
Yeah, so I think AI has been around for a long time, or different kinds of AI. I think we've had neural networks, we've had traditional machine learning, computer vision you were giving a great example of. But I think that large language models really changed the name of the game, and I think that this time really is different than the pace of innovation over the past, I say decade, of the last 2 years. Things are agentic AI, every new model is a lot better. I think that we are going to see a lot. We're early in the journey of what these models can do, but I do think that we've progressed so much in the last 2-3 years that the last decade as an example. I also kind of juxtapose where we're going through today in healthcare with AI with the digitization era of adopting software, and just take EMRs and EHRs as an example of digitizing medical records. It took us over a decade to do that. But I think post ChatGPT moment, it took our industry, or all providers, I guess Sonya can give a great example at Mayo, of adopting AI scribes. It's been an unprecedented pace. Over 80% of providers out there are testing and trying to use AI scribes in their workflow every day. So I do think that healthcare participants, either pharma, life sciences, payers, providers, are all testing and trying things, and I think that's very new. I think we want, executives are really excited about embedding this in their strategy and their day-to-day, and how do we become a technology company and a pharma company at the same time. I do think that the risk is a lot of these POCs or pilots are going to fail. Internal and external partnerships, and a lot of companies will fail, and how do we align our how do we become nimble as an industry to make go-no-go decisions more quickly, which is inherently hard in healthcare because we're conservative? And then how do we maintain that high expectation, but then also continue to be patient in how things will evolve and how we're going to realize value in a lot of the use cases? And we can get into the very specifics, but I do think that the excitement is here, and then maybe we're not going to meet with expectations at the pace that excitement is growing.
Yeah, that's great. Per?
Yeah, so I think I'll pick up on some of the things you also said there. So I think for me, the excitement in here, and I think the risk could be that it would disappear. And what I see has been a risk in the last couple of years is probably there's been a lot of hype here as well. And I think for me, it's really to try to move the AI into where we actually start to produce and make value for all the companies, for the products that we want to do. I want to say that if we take a step back, especially in the early discovery where we are sitting, is we had the AlphaGo moment with AlphaFold, which was able to predict protein structures. And all of a sudden there came all of this excitement, all of these investments. People really looked into this field and saying, this is going to challenge and change the way that we do healthcare. Absolutely correct. But then all of a sudden we also had all of the ideas that then we don't need to do experiments anymore. Then we don't need to think anymore, and so forth, right? So all of a sudden, you started to go into the other cleft of it and really get rid of a lot of things that are still necessary for this. I think one of the risks is that we still don't fully understand these tools. We still need to be very careful on what they can do at this time and moment, but also the potential of it. So really making sure that we still have the investments, that we still think about how to apply these tools. And then in the area that we are in the early development of biologics, it's based on science and data. So we need to make sure that it's rigorous whenever we do claims, that we have data and science to actually, support these things. And I think that for me is the risk, is that we don't oversell a technology that potentially could change the world that we live in. And again, end of the day, deliver much better medicines, innovative medicines to the patients in need of it.
Yeah, it's great. It's interesting because, basically we're talking right now about the different ways that AI is being applied in healthcare and life sciences. There's the application to innovation, and then there's the application to execution, right? You know, how do we change workflow and efficiency versus how do we help define, you know, the experiments that we're going to do in the case of AlphaFold? How do we, you know, streamline the processes of drug discovery by, you know, sort of cutting out years worth of work to try and figure out the structure of a protein? So when we think about, you know, large companies, small companies, institutions, and we think about what those organizations struggle with when they try to integrate AI into their practices, it'd be, you know, great to just hear what are some of the challenges so that you don't make the mistakes that, you know, Para was just saying. You know, what are some of the challenges that everybody faces when it comes to integrating these into the workflow or the general processes? Subha, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, happy to. I think, you know, one of the primary challenges for digital transformation, for lack of a better word, for integrating AI is, you know, not to think of it as a siloed product or a solution that operates in vacuum, but it has to integrate into these larger business processes, right? So if we take, so you know, my world is AI in clinical development, and it starts with how do we envision a protocol, right? So what are the components of a protocol? What is the right population to run trials in? You know, what are the right endpoints? And then, you know, there are statisticians involved. There are clinical pharmacologists involved in a large company where they're also contributing to this protocol. They're also they're creating analysis plans of how we're going to analyze this data, and then they're creating regulatory corpus that can be submitted to regulators. So this is a continuum, and there are lots of systems and experts involved at every stage of this process. So if there was an AI product or a solution that was impacting a part of this process, it's very important to think about, you know, how does this integrate with the larger systems? There might be a system that's actually storing the clinical data. There might be a system that stores prior protocols, for example. There might be a system that actually creates clinical study reports that get submitted to regulators. So thinking about that broader workflow and how this integrates is very important. And you know, particularly when innovators are building AI solutions, it's important to keep that context in mind so that you don't fall into the pitfalls of thinking that this is somehow going to solve a problem. Yes, it is solving that point solution, but how does that sort of integrate with the whole process?
Per, could you comment on when you're integrating it in a smaller company? What do you see as some of the challenges?
Yeah, I think maybe start a way that we've seen it as a small company. We also work with bigger companies and have experiences from bigger companies. And I think just to come a little bit back to it, I had a discussion yesterday with a person here in Boston about, you know, AI, and he said, I will refuse to use the word revolution about AI. And I understand what he's trying to say with it, but I think what it's really changed is the way that we work about things, and then I'll come back and answer your questions in a second, right? But clearly right now, it has transformed the way to work in the sense that, for example, in a big pharma setting, you know, whenever you identified an antibody that was a lead, you took the lead and then you ran with it, right, as fast as possible. With these AI algorithms, I think we need to reverse the way that we think, in the sense that we now need to put the AI in the center and then generate data for that. And I think when it comes to big and small companies, I think one of the great things is that the ecosystem is expanding in the sense that there are room for all of us to be here, because we all play different roles in order to actually generate these tools. So for a small company like us, I think one of the things that we can do with bigger companies or bigger partners is that we can take on the piece of the value chain we believe that where we can actually make a difference. So where we are is in the discovery and hit to lead optimization, where we believe that we can bring on tools, not because we are an independent solution, but as a partner that brings knowledge into this space such that for bigger companies, they can then accelerate making more innovative drugs. I think that's where we are. But I think on the other hand, I think it's changed the way we need to think about these problems at the end of the day. And I think that's where the revolution comes in.
Sofia, maybe a question for you as an investor. When you think about a product that's been developed by a company that's going to be integrated into a workflow in a company, how do you recognize a product that is going to be more easily, put to use, whether it be in innovation or whether it be in, workflow? What do you look for to understand whether it's actually ready for prime time or ready to be integrated?
That's a great question, because we are getting bombarded by every company is a point solution. I think why you mentioned this. And I think to me, what's most interesting is, okay, what is your kind of wedge in a market? What's the problem you're solving? And it's not really like what's the technology, because I think technology or AI is just like you're cobbling a bunch of different models and user interfaces and workflow and software, like a necklace, and those are like different pearls as part of like the process to what you were mentioning. What we look at for a Series A investment as an example is, are you solving a core problem? How big of a problem is that to your user? And to the person who holds the budget, and what value are they deriving from what you're providing? So can you measure return on investment and measure the impact that you're having through your solution? That could be leading indicators of that would be utilization. So how often are folks using and querying and leveraging or living in your tool? What are all the different steps in the process that you're guiding? And then ultimately, what is the return on that investment? Is it a revenue generator? Is it a cost savings, productivity? And then what value does the customer place on the solution? And it takes time to prove that, but I think the companies that are most successful for external investment are the ones that can measure that quickly, because that's how, as a buyer, you're going to be measuring that within 6 months to see if you want to like extend from your proof of concept to the rest of the organization and like really put meaningful budget for that.
Sonya, can you take it from there with Sofia's, sort of within an institution that would be integrating potentially out, sort of products that are developed outside and then needing to be integrated?
Yeah, so, it's funny, you can develop the best algorithm with the least amount of bias and have tested it in different health systems, and your work is really just beginning. So to kind of reemphasize what you've said is, what problem, what is this a solution for, and how do we measure the outcomes? And then also, how do we actually integrate it into the clinical workflow so you can see those outcomes? So I think the clinical context is extremely complex. There's variability across providers, specialties, health systems, patient types. And to be able to solve a problem in a way that benefits multiple different wedges is challenging, but it doesn't mean it can't be done. It means that we have to be very mindful of understanding the pieces like bias and how to tune an algorithm to be, suited for a different population. We need to actually understand how to get into the workflow. So one piece that we work on a lot at Mayo Clinic platform is actually the deployment piece. So getting into the workflow doesn't just mean the user clicks a button and then there's an external web page, right? Like I said, the best algorithm and the best solution that solves a real problem might still fail. So there's all sorts of complexities behind that as well in terms of just the technology readiness and things like that for different health systems. So when we think about how to solve these problems, what we think about is how we can level the playing field first with data validation and deployment capabilities so that those wedges aren't so hyper-specific, and that way point solutions are also not as overwhelming to not just the end user, but to the health system who is potentially purchasing them.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you said the health system that's purchasing them, because that's a huge enterprise, right? Mm-hmm. And if it's to show the efficiency to make it worth the cost, you have to be able to demonstrate
financial and clinical benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe just quickly we have something here.
Oh, the back.
Are we back?
We're back.
Are we back?
We're back. Yeah, good.
So?
Okay. No, are we back again?
Yes.
We're gone again. No, we're here.
We're on.
This is okay.
We're back. We're back.
Subha, really quickly before it happens again, what would you say are use cases for when an organization should be considering building versus buying? You know, so there's build your own versus buy. Where would you say there's obvious use cases for one versus the other?
I mean, I think there's obviously opportunities for both, right? And typically, when it's a new problem and there is internal expertise, it's easier to rapidly run proof of concepts, as you were saying. It's always feasibility versus value, right? So if it's feasible, you've got the technology at hand and you have the internal expertise, then I think that's something that you quickly build in-house. I mean, some examples would be, I would say the productivity equation is somewhat positive now with generative AI. There are lots of solutions that are being integrated. So, is it, there's a solution, let's say, that's creating first drafts of clinical study reports. Now, can you run a proof of concept to go a little bit more upstream to create protocols or analysis plans, et cetera? And if you have the internal expertise, that I think makes perfect sense to build a proof of concept, where it makes sense to partner with vendors, et cetera, is when you need to do the scale up, right? So when you want to go from that proof of concept phase to hundreds of users or thousands of users even globally, then I think the partnership absolutely makes sense. Another area where partnerships make sense is, like Per was mentioning, if there's a very unique area of expertise, let's say. I think, as the value chain kind of moves left, are we identifying new targets, de novo building molecules, et cetera. If there are niche expertise in partners where there's this very specialized or specific algorithms. I mean, in the case of AI, so that's one. And then I guess the last one I'd mention is speed is critical. So we see, for example, we were mentioning from longitudinal data sets, mining electronic medical records to identify patients for a clinical trial, let's say, as a good use case here. We get a lot of associations, but how do you quickly validate and verify that this, in fact, are the right patients to actually deploy or follow up, et cetera? And, there, for example, causal inference comes to mind as a way to filter out these associations, going from thousands of associations to something that can be more quickly validated and put in the hands of experts. So if there are those niche algorithmic expertise, those are other areas that we typically tend to partner because it gives us speed to rapidly move forward quickly. So it's speed as opposed to perfection, so that we can continuously run these experiments to teach ourselves, how we can move faster in terms of running our clinical trials and bringing the best medicines to patients.
Great. So I have a question that I'm going to ask both Sofia and Per, which we're going to start to get into being a highly regulated environment and how we want to talk about regulatory and compliance and other things. How, as a relatively new company, Per, sort of you started and, developed this company, and Sofia, you make investments. How do you sort of determine the probability of success when you think that you're moving into a highly regulated environment? And so it might be that some of your activities are so upstream that you worry less about a regulatory consideration, or it may be the type of thing where it's not yet a regulatory consideration because, as Subha has said before, it's internal facing as opposed to external facing. But would like to just hear both of your comments on, when you think about building a company and assessing that probability, or when you think about investing in a company and assessing that probability.
Do you want to
start? Great. All right, so I personally don't make investments in the therapeutic side, which inherently have regulatory approval processes, but then there are very clear outlines on what are the milestones that a drug developer needs to go through and proof points to kind of pass that process. And generally, when you're investing in a drug or a company that's developing drugs, there is a lot of regulatory risk and scientific risk, but the market risk is a lot lower, right? Because if the drug is going to prove efficacious, there's going to be willingness to pay and patients that need this and the system that is already developed for that. I think in areas where you don't fall in those regulatory pathways that have been very clearly outlined, you can use regulation as an asset. So always be thinking about how does changes in regulation can be tailwinds to what you're doing. I generally spend time on the services, software side. So this is more, a regulation is opening an opportunity for conversations between payers and providers to better negotiate out-of-network claims, as an example. How does the new regulation regime create the right incentives for a process to happen, and then how can you enable that process to be more successful at doing that? Probably it will be the same between payers and pharma, as an example. How is drug pricing negotiated? How do we do outcomes-based pricing for gene and cell therapies, as an example? I think new regulations and changes can enable new markets to be created and companies to take advantage of that. So don't make regulation a liability, but more of an asset. So those are the types of things that I invest in. And generally when I get companies that pitch us, like, we need to get regulatory approval, but then there's also huge market risk because we don't know if after you develop your algorithm to diagnose X, you're going to be able to get paid for it, because then you need to get payers to want to come. The types of risks that you're taking at an early stage as an investor are too greater. So how do we think about what are the types of risks that you want to be taking as an early stage company, and then your job as the CEO and founder is how are you going to de-risk that in a milestone-based process that enables you to raise more capital to then continue to build and de-risk the different parts of that. So are you taking market risk? Are you taking regulation? Are you taking technology risk? But don't take all of them at the same time would be my advice. Yeah.
Then I'll go. First of all, I think it's a very, very good question. And I don't think it's a question you necessarily think of initially. When we start out, what we wanted to do was just, utilize technology to create awesome, new, innovative molecules for patients. And then you start to grow up on many levels to actually figure out the world is probably more complicated than that. And I think, if you asked me 10 years ago, I'd say, yeah, right. I mean, these algorithms will never be such that's actually something that we need to take into account. Like now we are in the early part of the value chain, so we're mainly where you discover biologics, engineer biologics to do stuff. We develop algorithms for this as well. And of course, everything, created for good can also be created for evil in a sense, right? So clearly there are regulations in this space, and that's why, it's a little shame our FDA person is not here, or somebody from a governmental institution, because it'd be interesting to hear what their stance on this is. For us, we try to do the best that we can do and do good with this for patients in need of it, and that's how we'll continue utilizing these tools. But it's a complicated question, to be very honest with you.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just ask you just tag on to that question. When you think about moving it downstream and you think about manufacturing, for example, or you think about process control, et cetera, and decision-making around, process control, can you see that as being a more challenging?
Oh, it will absolutely be much more challenging once you start to go into that part of the value chain. And I think even, clinical trials, humans, even a disease target identification, you can start to see that these things could be very, very problematic if they're not regulated.
Yeah. Maybe taking a sort of a step beyond just the regulators per se, but compliance. And what are some of the constraints when you're integrating a new system? And maybe I'll ask Sonya, you and Subha to sort of comment on what things do you have to consider when you are anticipating a use case? And what are some of the hurdles that you see in being able to assure compliance with certain kinds of tools, and what can be done to potentially enhance the ability to be able to ensure that compliance?
Yeah, I think we are very used to, as health systems, sort of thinking about the operational risk of certain technologies. I think AI-based technologies introduce another layer of complexity. And I think, routinely the way we think about this in accordance with, obviously, regulations, which we know are, subject to different forces. But we think about a few core pieces, right? Beyond our normal frameworks, we also have to think of the data privacy aspects to the patients in a different way, right? LLMs are a great example. What's being memorized? How is it being memorized? And we can understand that by looking at certain aspects of technical aspects behind the model. We also, think about things as sort of, we work in the land of de-identified data, But de-identified data also requires various sort of mechanisms to ensure security and privacy, so we can't just hand over tens of millions of records. But how do we think about that in a way that's sort of in an aggregate perspective, but by use case, so that we can enable the safe and effective use? And then, I think there's other pieces that we're starting to think about now as risk. So we've also, just as you mentioned, we've developed our own risk stratification and classification criteria for clinical solutions because there's just so much heterogeneity. So we think of different use cases. There's a few tiers that we have, and for each tier in terms of the potential clinical risk and the technical risk, we also think of what the safeguards and the guidelines and guardrails that we implement in addition to sort of just the fundamental standards.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
So as a highly regulated industry, for us, compliance and regulation kind of go hand in hand. But it's always, the challenge of how do you balance innovation with the regulation and the compliance so that, you're still continuing to deploy these innovative solutions. So I'll give one example. So about a year and a half ago, and this was GPT 1.0 days, which seems like ancient history, which was just about a year ago, right? And so we ran a global challenge to draft safety sections in clinical study reports. And we had to do this in a way that was compliant with all the standards that were then, and then now obviously new guardrails are being put in place. And we also had to engage external partners. How do you make the data available from prior studies that were going to be used as training data sets from prior CSRs, and then enabling our vendor partners to then create these safety sections either using their own proprietary models or GPT models. And so we spent quite a bit of time whiteboarding the design of this to make sure that we were creating sandboxes so that each of the vendor partners were not able to see each of the solutions. This was a challenge, right? So we call it a breakthrough challenge. And at the same time, they're also running within the guardrails of the company, so that the prior data sets, even though they were published CSRs, they were hand curated to provide the 70% data set as training and the 30% for testing, were all within that framework. So, a lot of time was spent really thinking about the guardrails and the compliance aspects of this. But now that we have a blueprint, we can quickly rinse and repeat for new challenges, right? And that's where I think the balance comes into play. So, while we want to move fast, sometimes just pause and think about what are these frameworks. But once you have that framework established and negotiated with all of the stakeholders, then you can quickly innovate for future projects. So.
Sofia, were you going to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I love that example because it's a great point that I wanted to make is, I'm looking at the glass half full for compliance and the role that AI can play, because if you look at kind of technology or transparency of data and tractability of decisions, if you're able to reimagine the system from the start, thinking about, hey, what are all the decisions that are being made and how do we track those decisions in a compliant way, you can have that data that proves that you're being compliant versus just a human making a decision and we just don't know what went into the process of making that decision. That could be clinical decisions. So in the process of, hey, can the AI surface potential diagnoses and then the potential data to make that decision, and then can a clinician make a decision as an example? Or how do you think of the different steps and break it out and then track that over time? So when regulation starts to catch up with the technology, we can actually use a lot of those data sets to prove the role that technology plus humans can do to make a better outcome, clinical decision, drug development decision, and the such.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a lot about validation, but different than sort of the intentional validation that you have to do, often in the more therapeutics, sort of based industry. But you're kind of validating as you go all the time. I'm going to just change the topic for a minute because we've mentioned data a few times and sort of open this up to the panel and whoever wants to comment. But, we did have a conversation when we were planning for this session about, the pros and cons of, sort of open source data versus, people having their own data versus buying proprietary platforms that can access data that you wouldn't be able to access without those platforms. But, really just in a general, sort of comment, what is the biggest impediment of finding the right data sources to be able to train the systems to do what you want them to do? What's the biggest impediment, and then what are the biggest opportunities to get over those impediments?
Yeah, so, I think we've spoken a little bit about model generalizability, at least referred to it. So we know that data is the foundation, obviously, for an AI algorithm, the garbage in, garbage out adage. Now, it's difficult because there's different models, like you mentioned, of data sharing. You can kind of centralize the data into one source and access it that way. There's risks to that, like data leakage, there's security, privacy, there's control issues from the institution. So we've really leaned into a federated model at Mayo Clinic platform. So we've de-identified our data, so millions of patients, and we're as part of a global federated network, we have partners across the nation as well as the world. And so with a federated model, we believe, and we are starting to see, that we can help democratize that access to data a little bit easier. So a small startup, an innovator, normally to get access to one health system's data, they have to go through months, sometimes years, of kind of provisioning and to just get a chance at that access. By having a de-identified model, when federating the different nodes, we can more easily at least provide access to data to everyone from large pharma companies to smaller solution developers to other clinicians in a way that we feel is safer, because the data lives within the constructs of each data node, subject to their privacy principles, and models can be trained on different data sources to hopefully create more applicable and generalizable models. So that's kind of the approach we're taking, and there's surely others, but that's definitely the one that we feel most comfortable with, given our ability to kind of access different populations across the world.
Yeah, I think to build on that, I mean, most of real-world evidence data is not regulatory grade. They were not collected for regulatory purposes, and they were created for clinical care or for billing purposes, right? And so if we want to, so some of the challenges we face is we want to augment clinical trial data, which is really the gold standard from randomized controlled trials, with augmented regulatory grade real-world evidence data. Then the question is, how can we start filling those gaps in RWE data sets, right? And that could come from preclinical data or other pharmacological studies that could potentially fill these gaps. I think the beauty of the situation in which we are in is that we have large amounts of data that we didn't have even a decade ago, right? I think there was this one statistic that if you look at genomics data, the amount of genomics data that's being collected on an annual basis, if you put them on CD-ROMs, you can actually go from the Earth to the Moon in a quarter of a way back, right? That's the amount of data that we collect. So that's the beauty of the situation in which we are in. But then, what we need to work on is making these data sets AI ready. And the question we always face is, do we need to boil the ocean, right? So how can we constrain what data sets we are standardizing, what data sets we are harmonizing, what data sets we are connecting to each other, from, say, transcriptomics data to imaging data to phenotypic information from longitudinal data sets? Could that be informed by the clinical questions so that you're filling the gaps and making them really robust and rigorous so we can take them to regulators, right, for an approval of a drug? So I think those are some considerations with the data sets. I think creating regulatory grade real world data is going to occupy a lot of our minds for the next few years.
And then maybe, Per, I'll ask you to comment on this, and Subha, you might have a comment as well. What about changing access to proprietary data that's come out of, for example, pharma or other healthcare systems, where the things that go wrong, right? How valuable that data would be into training some of the systems that we're developing to help innovation. So do you have any sort of ideas for how, we could be working together, small companies, large companies, to find a way to share access to that kind of data to build systems that could change it for all of us?
That's a brilliant question. How long time do we have?
Yeah, right.
No. So I think that's spot on, especially around data and how important data are. And let me start like we all, again, for the AlphaGo moment in the early discovery part, development of antibodies, it came with AlphaFold 2, built on 50 years of data collection through PDB, which was a public initiative to actually collect and standardize data. And then we could actually see the fruits of that. So I think clearly access to data. And I think one of the things that we are trying to push for with others in the space is actually to standardize data, making sure that the data can be interpreted by different persons in different contexts, by having the right references, make sure that we actually design the experiments correct, and make sure that whenever you publish something, you actually have references such that other scientists can access your data, onboard this data, and utilize that data. So I think there are some easy low-hanging fruits. Now, when it comes to the more proprietary data, we have tried to be part of, 3, 4, 5 consortiums. And it always, everybody is so happy and enthusiastic in the beginning of this. Then the lawyers come to the room, and then, 6 months later, we're all told, no, you can't do it. So there are also these kind of obstacles or real-world problems that we need to address. But I think, just going, looking at the PDB and get inspiration from that, and then start to standardize data, making sure that we can go to the next step here. In my space, it's like functional biology. Make sure that we standardize that we collect the data, that we actually, try to contribute so that we all can. Because at the end of the day, we are all interested in solving this problem. Just one comment, and then I'll leave it back to you. But for example, developability of antibodies, right? Collecting viscosity data is very expensive. It's time-consuming for every single company that wants to make a therapeutic. Immunogenicity, we touched upon that when we actually had this discussion before this panel here today. Very expensive. Everybody needs those data points. And those are the ones where I think that we collectively should actually start to think a little bit bigger, because it's not great to just look at developability. We want to make products that actually make a difference in the world. So I think we need to start to change the mindset around this, and then hopefully the lawyers will come around one day and say, green light, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's coming to a way of helping everybody understand that some of the most important data is not the data that helps any industry compete, right? It's what makes you say no to something. It's not what makes you say yes to something. So if you could find a way to be sharing the mistakes that we've all made or the bad outcomes without believing that you're putting your competitive advantage at risk, because it's really about seeing what we can do as opposed to what we haven't been able to do, but that haven't been able to do put into these systems could be incredibly valuable.
Maybe just a sort of comment to that, and I think that comes back to the point earlier on about the mind shift and change of mindset around data science that we do, is that all of a sudden negative data are actually also very important for these algorithms. And I think there's been a tendency, especially in publications or public data set, to hide it a little bit away as being embarrassing that it didn't work. But I think for algorithms, that's exactly what they need. They need to see the full picture of this in order to actually generalize and make sure that they can then come up with a solution for that. So I think it's spot on that also the negative actually have value.
So maybe just to quickly comment on the federation models as well, right? So we don't always have to centralize the pre-competitive data, because if there is a bit of discomfort in sharing this information, you can actually now run machine learning models inside the firewalls of organizations like hospitals, and then the insights could be brought together based on how the understanding is between partners. IMI comes to mind, the Innovative Medicines Institute, where lots of groups share pre-competitive data to build models. Vivli is another platform where prior clinical trials data sets are shared through these platforms from sponsors, which are now available for researchers to ask additional questions that the clinical trial did not ask. So those are just a few mechanisms for pre-competitive data sharing.
Yeah, that's great.
And I will say this does highlight a very important key aspect. So when you were asking about sort of some of the challenges, right, there's the IP, the security, there's also data quality and standardization issues, right? So the best we can do to adhere to the common data model, so in our model, we actually kind of enforce a common data model with quality metrics, but the best we can do with that will kind of enhance our success, because how data stored as one field in one location is very different than the other. So kind of on the vein of, we need to know our negatives as well, we also need to understand the variability so that we can kind of get the most out of our AI models and the data sharing, whatever data sharing model we choose.
And I'll make the capitalist comment of you also need to align incentives for parties to want to participate. So between payers, between pharma and potentially providers or health systems, how can health systems monetize the data that they have, and how does pharma benefit from that, right? And then can you tie that to the outcome or the not just the drug discovery and how you're going to monetize that, because that's what pharma wants, but then patient recruitment and then how trial sites get paid. Like really think about the little carrots and sticks to bring like lots of parties to the table.
Yeah, it's that integration again. I mean, we keep hearing about how important that is. I'm going to ask you each a question here, and then we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. So we're expecting hearty participation, so start be thinking about your questions. But as all of you think about the future of AI, and when we say future, let's say 5 years, because that's like, centuries in regular terms. What are you most excited about? Not necessarily predictions, but what are each of you most excited about? So Sonya, we'll start with you.
I'm excited to operate at the top of my license. When I say that, I mean I spend a lot of time doing work that, solutions that can solve problems of summarization or data visualization can help improve so that I can spend more time actually talking to my patient. And I think it seems basic, it seems fundamental, but I think rather than, and then there's also great solutions that will change medicine altogether that I'm very excited about, but that component itself to allow me to not have to go pull information. I spend 8 hours before I start a shift just reading every note on a patient in my panel just so that I can feel confident that I have the true reliable source of data. That time can be better spent. And so I'm really excited to be able to hopefully have trustworthy systems that can alleviate that core fundamental problem so that then the exciting solutions that solve very novel problems and niche issues, we can then actually think about those more.
Excellent.
So I'm super excited about the concept of AI as a teacher. And the idea is very simple, right? So if you actually look at OpenAI's reasoning models and you chat with them, you can actually, and other companies have these reasoning models as well, you can actually just simply add an additional prompt that says, show me your work, and it actually starts to walk you through the stepwise details of how it actually arrived at an answer. And that can train our own brains of how should we systematically think about a problem. I think we can all learn from having, chatting on a regular basis with Gemini or whatever AI tool that you have. And, one of the best things we can do is not be on the sidelines. Just roll up our sleeves and test these models because they're not perfect. And I think to the point that was made earlier, not all of it is for good. I mean, it can also be used for not so great things. And the only way to develop the right guardrails is if we know all the details of how these tools work. So, for example, I tell my friends who are very skeptical about AI is just spend a Saturday afternoon looking at the README files of how to prompt some of these systems. And on Monday, you're already a better prompt engineer, right? And you can actually talk to these AI systems better. So using AI as a teacher to help us think better.
I think both of your comments relate to how I'm thinking about it is like, how do we make AI adoption less emotional of a journey for any role that you're in? How do you make it, it's an extension and another arm to what I do in whatever role I'm in, right? It's going to give me superhuman powers to accomplish that. Operate at the top of your license as a physician. If you're in the back office, how do you do 10 times what you were supposed to do before? And I think like seeing human plus robot be 1 + 1 = 10, I think is what will be like really exciting in 5 years if everyone feels like that's the role versus AI is here to take your job away. And we need to like have that conversation because it's an emotional journey for everyone in any industry, but particularly in healthcare.
First of all, you're always welcome to call me if you need an imperfect chatbot. So I put my name down there.
I will.
I am very, very excited about the products in the therapeutic space that we'll be able to bring forward. And I think we already start to see that. When we talk with patient organizations, they tell us about treatments like 10, 15 years ago. And what we have, in the pipeline, it's all of us, right? It's amazing how that's going to change the life of people. So I think creativity will be at a completely new level with what we can actually do. 5, 10 years ago, we simply couldn't do it. We knew which molecules that we would like to generate, but we were like, no, that's not going to happen in my lifetime. I actually think now we will be able to make them, and I'm super excited about that. So I do believe that with that, we'll make a better world. So that's my 5 years plan.
I think it's amazing. I think, we always talk about when we're really thinking about human capital, not just our financial capital, who are people who have pattern recognition, right? And that only comes with experience. It doesn't come with knowledge, right? I've been in the industry 40 years, and I have this much pattern recognition compared to what AI could bring to helping us solve problems. And so I think that we've all respected and appreciated pattern recognition for a very long time. It's time for us to not be afraid that it's coming from someplace other than ourselves. So I think it's going to be very exciting. Okay, we're going to go to Q&A, and we have more questions that we can talk about if you don't come up with any, but it would be great. So somebody's right here, and then, go. The microphone, people have to go to. Okay, the microphone, I can't see. Is it in the middle? It's in the middle. Okay.
I guess I realized first where the microphone
is.
Okay.
Did you have an algorithm for that, or you just figured it out by yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So Alex Sherman, Mass General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, sorry. So 2 minor and related questions. One is, I haven't heard about the biggest elephant from my perspective in the room. What are the incentives on data sharing to all the players in this ecosystem? And sometimes hospitals like Mayo are shy to admit that they want to monetize their patients' data. Sometimes they say, no, we're not sharing, we're not selling our patients' data, and so on. So that's one thing. And another thing, we're all sharing with this precondition not to be reshared, right? So we want everyone to come to you and to sign off on their obligations not to reshare. So when does a model is not data? In other words, so if you use my data to build a model or enrich your AI and to benefit, and I do not, so when a new art, what constitutes new art, if you wish? Just reformatting the data in a model, AI, container, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Subha, do you want to start, or Sonya? Either one. Yeah.
Sure. For the first questions about the incentives, so that's an excellent question, because we have this conversation daily with our health system partners, and there's a self-selecting group of institutions that want to share data so that they can create better AI solutions. Now, that's one incentive. So create stronger, better models that have can mitigate bias in a bit more effectively. Another incentive is the IP piece. So the ability to share data while also having the controls to retain IP is massively critical, and it's massively important to ensure that. And that, again, goes without saying that security and privacy incentives are massively also important, but specifically the wanting to create models that are better, wanting to retain IP, and also the model of being able to actually commercialize those solutions in a way that can be distributed across different health systems, but also tracked in a way that kind of ensures that everyone's getting kind of out of it what they need to. In addition, another piece is the validation aspect of actually getting the data and testing. So there's various pieces that kind of speak to different health systems, but for us, that's what we see as huge drivers.
So I think 2 aspects, right? One is it can actually be a mandate. So if the patient consents to share that data more broadly than what it was actually intended to use, then you actually share that. So prior to my Pfizer life, was part of another organization that worked with patients with pancreatic adenocarcinomas. These are extremely sick patients, and in fact, they request that their data be shared out for future research in pancreatic cancer. So looking for those use cases in that self-selection where data sharing is a requirement based on patient consent. The second is, I think just given the world in which we live in, not everybody, it does take a village to do early research, right? So we need government organizations, you need not-for-profit organizations, you need pharmaceuticals, you need academic partnerships. And there is a clear recognition that that type of research, pre-competitive research, cannot happen within one organization. So, I think surfacing that incentive and making it clear that innovation can come from any corner who are leveraging these shared data sets, and then they can further be developed through a partnership with a pharma company. And I think making that really clear also enables data sharing. But I do agree that, having very clear incentives or structures for data sharing will enable more data sharing and people to engage with it. I don't think it's a solved problem. I think we as a community need to solve this problem because we need to make these data sets, pre-competitive data sets, not just available, but also AI ready so that they can be leveraged.
Yeah, I think there's also the ethical consideration that everybody puts over this.
Patient data.
Which, how we handle informed consent in the future and how IRBs are looking at things will be very critical to this as well.
Maybe can I just short one? So I think, in the, early development discovery phase, it should be driven by economics, but I also think economics will be there by sharing these data sets in order to develop. We can develop it faster. Getting a drug delayed by a day, depending on what kind of drug, is like $8 million or something like that, depending on how you do the calculation. So the economics for doing this faster, is huge for this. And then maybe just put in a perspective, we actually have these discussions quite a lot, not only us, but with others around opening source our code, right? And what we see is that by those that actually open source their code and their weights, et cetera, they engage the whole ecosystem. And that means that all of a sudden, instead of being 10 researchers, you are like 10,000 or even more researchers developing into the space that you've initiated. So I think from our point of view, the more open that we are, not naive, not everything can probably be done from day to day, but there's a huge untapped potential by doing it.
Absolutely. Next question.
I'm Sonya Timberlake. I'm a developer in biotech. I have a follow-up question on that. And specifically for data sharing, like in the federated learning model, I'm so glad you shared that Mayo Clinic is doing that and Pfizer's thinking about it. What do you think are the main barriers to doing that more? Because I see very few examples of pharma doing this, especially in the preclinical space. Are they political, about aligning incentives? Is it technical, sort of the maturity of those models? Is it logistical, getting the data AI ready? Like, what do we need to do to see more of that?
With respect to pharma specifically?
With respect to pharma and especially in the preclinical space.
Yeah, and I will also very much so happy to defer to my pharma colleagues as well. But, for Mayo Clinic, we're working with health systems. And so the barriers we see with health systems are probably a little bit different depending on the type of company, the type of pharmaceutical company. But they also are similar in the sense of there is an infrastructure requirement, there is cost requirement. Adhering to a common data model is also a requirement with quality issues. Pharmaceutical data is actually, we work a lot with companies in this space, more as sort of a utilizer of the data. But as a different node, there's definitely a future where we consider how those different nodes can be kind of incorporated. There are different rules and regulations that go along with that, however, so it's a little bit more complex that, you all might have more insight into as well.
So just to make sure I understood your question, why isn't preclinical data being utilized by pharma, or why isn't preclinical data that's generated by pharma not shared in a data sharing consortium?
Yeah, like in the situation of federated learning, where you can still protect your source data.
So if I understand your question correctly, so in a federated setting, why aren't people using more of that federated structure to utilize the data sets? So I think it's all of the reasons that you mentioned, right? So I think technologically, making that data set AI ready and enabling machine learning algorithms requires technical expertise at each one of these sites. So there could be technical barriers here. Clearly, there is financial incentives as well. I mean, there are a lot of data vendors or data partners. They could be academic medical systems. They could be companies that are making those data sets available that get purchased. They have a niche data sets. So are there clear financial incentives for sharing and partnering? The areas where I've seen that work really well is if there is a common disease area of interest. So take, for example, Crohn's disease or IBD, et cetera, right? So maybe there are a few partners who are very much interested in researching in that area. They come together and share that information, and pharma's at the table, academic medical centers are at the table, regulators are at the table. You might have somebody like an FNIH, which is sort of facilitating this public-private partnerships, and they tend to focus on certain disease areas of interest. So I think that's
how we actually, that's exactly
as a very disease-specific, rather than sort of boiling the ocean,
not just
to
all the
say
data,
where is that connectivity and interest. And I think once that's clarified, then the flow of data happens much more easily.
Yeah, it's exactly how we operate.
I think there's been examples over many, many years, though, in pharma that there are databases on even tox studies. What's been done prior to starting a clinical trial, what's killed a product, right? And there's, people were always talking about how can we share that data. But I think that now there's technology that could allow that data to be shared without putting anybody in a sensitive position with regard to it impacting the products that they have finally developed. So that's just something I think that the whole industry has been interested in understanding. Does a certain chemotype always result in a certain or often result in a certain outcome that would have you then avoid that chemotype permanently? They learn it over time just by virtue of publications and discussions, but there so much could be expedited with that sort of sharing.
Thanks.
Maybe just a comment, just short one here. I think maybe also challenge the amount of data that's actually AI ready out there. I think that's also a pretty, an assumption where I think it can be discussed about how much is actually available. We often talk about amounts of data and not actually information content of data, which are two different things. So I think, we are still, in this mind shift where we need to generate the data for the AI.
And the cost.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. One last question.
Thanks. Thanks for the fascinating discussion, by the way. Real quick, I should reveal I'm from an R&D cloud company called Benchling, so I have a little bit of an agenda, but my question is around the prerequisites to using AI. Of course, LLMs are super powerful. Other algorithms can be super powerful in terms of extracting value from data, making sense of it, making predictions, et cetera. What are your perspectives on kind of being able to bring together data in the first place from disparate sources with different, architectures in order to make it available to be interrogated by AI? Do you see like technologies or solutions in the industry that are changing, that are making this problem easier? Because from where I sit and where we sit, that consumes, arguably the largest part of the hours, the person hours required to bring these solutions to reality.
Our anchor is sort of multimodal longitudinal data sets. So, we 100% agree, right? Making a decision based off of structured EHR data is not how I operate as a clinician. So what we are doing is we are taking EKGs, imaging, et cetera, and connecting them via a longitudinal mechanism to the patient. I think to answer sort of which technologies, and so that's a larger, I think, conversation that maybe we can share another time, but I would just say I agree that there is a lot of need for that to make data useful.
I mean, we tend to rely on partners, right? So if you're an expert with wearable data and you've got phenotypic information, then, what does that connectivity look like? I mean, I'd also challenge the notion of, creating these multimodal foundational models all the time. So I'll give you an example. I mean, so, classic one is, CRS syndrome, which we sometimes see as a cytokine reaction syndrome, which you see with many diseases, oncological, immunological, et cetera. And, maybe things like vital signs can predict CRS, But if you combine that with very deep proteomics data and other multimodal data, maybe you could predict this better. But then the patient has less than 48 hours to actually get to the hospital to get treated for CRS. So in that situation, do we really need a multimodal type situation? So I think it's a very use case by use case based. At least the approach that we take is, where do you really need that multimodal integration versus maybe one or two types of data that need to be connected. I think there is definitely a technological challenge of formats, et cetera, that in the case of variables, depending on the variable type, there could be different formats. So I could see that being a challenge as well in terms of harmonization, but also would challenge the notion of large foundational multimodal models for every use case, which may not always be necessary.
Sofia?
Yeah, no, another way of saying this, I think we're assuming that more data is better, and then the more complex the data set, the better it will be, and I think that often is not the case. You can have smaller data sets and show it to a particular type of model that is going to give you a better answer, and then share to another set of data to another model that's going to give you a better set of an answer to a particular question you're asking. And it's really about like what you expose to what and how you make those decisions to curate the data versus just creating a more complex data set.
Thank you.
Great. So just very quickly, we're going to wrap up, and we're going to ask each of our panelists if they would spend 1 minute basically saying, what you would want to say about how we should prioritize things, or what's a call to action. If you could, solicit the participation of this crowd in changing, sort of how we see the future of AI and how it's applied, what would you ask? So Per, we'll start with you.
I don't think I need a minute for that, but I'll try to make it brief. I think I've iterated this a couple of times, and I think the key for success for these methods and also for actually generating economics around this is clear around sharing data and making sure that we start to standardize this in a much more systematic way, and then make it accessible to people out there. I think there's a whole ecosystem that could be built around this and make it very successful for the products that we want to generate. So I think for me, data.
To follow on that, and I'll pick on the standard portion of what you said, not the data part, but how do we standardize processes? Or in an organization, we're willing to think that we can just have a standard process for something that another organization will do too, versus we do this in a very particular way and we're not willing to change that, because that will enable external partners to develop best of breed solutions for what you're doing, and it will compound the impact that we'll have if one vendor can do something really good versus you developing everything internally. But obviously I'm biased because I want startups to be able to do that, and partners to want to be able to standardize processes as well.
So I think in terms of call to action, data and process are critical, so I won't mention that. I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is, how is AI really changing our ways of working? So I would really challenge all of us to think about, not in terms of FTE reduction and what jobs AI is going to replace, but rather, how is this changing our ways of working? How are we going to uplift and train, folks so that it could be a true co-pilot, right? So what is that new way of working? Like, how is my job going to change a few years down the road? So I think if all of us can start thinking about that very carefully and starting to incorporate AI, but at the same time, making sure that there is a role for creativity and for human intelligence to be part of all this. So how is AI changing our ways of working?
So initially, I still will say data. I would say data quality, and starting from the foundation and making sure that the data we're using is actually pre-processed. It's the derivative elements are thoughtfully laid out. I think the impact of high quality data is massive. And I would also just say patience. I think we're going very quickly in amazing ways, but we also just need to make sure we have the checks to make sure that we are validating, collecting outcomes, making sure we have tools to support transparency, safety, reliability, and those should be done in parallel.
I think it's great. Well, I think, a call to action I would say is, I think all of us have the opportunity to be disruptors and innovators and take advantage of the incredible efficiencies that could be created by, sort of more, coming together of the data, more standardization of the processes. I think it's all very critical. But this is an amazing panel. I'm so grateful that I got an opportunity